Imagine standing in the middle of one of the most iconic tennis venues in the world, surrounded by thousands of passionate Spanish fans who have grown up breathing the sport, and then a 19-year-old girl from the Philippines picks up the microphone and starts speaking to them in their own language, not haltingly, not with an apologetic smile between words, but with the kind of ease that makes you forget for a second that she was born on the other side of the planet. That is exactly what happened in Madrid, and if you blinked, you might have missed why it was so extraordinary. Boris Becker, a man who has spent decades in this sport as a player, a coach, a commentator, a man who has seen nearly everything tennis has to offer, went quiet. Not the kind of quiet where he was searching for something to say. The kind of quiet where words feel unnecessary because what just happened speaks entirely for itself. And that reaction, that rare moment of speechlessness from someone who is literally paid to always have something to say, tells you more about what Alex Eala did on that court than any highlight reel ever could. So, let's talk about it properly. Because this story did not begin in Madrid. It did not begin with a microphone or a crowd erupting or a German tennis legend staring in disbelief at his monitor. It began years earlier, in a small town in Mallorca called Manacor, where a young girl from the Philippines made a decision that most teenagers never have the courage to even consider. She left everything familiar behind and stepped into an environment where she understood almost nothing, where the signs on the road were in a foreign language, where her coaches spoke to her in words she had to decode in real time, where the culture around her operated on rhythms and references she had no map for. Most people, given that situation, would find ways to stay on the surface. Pick up just enough of the language to function. Keep a little emotional distance from the culture. Protect yourself from the discomfort of full immersion by treating the foreign environment as temporary, as a place you are visiting rather than a place you are becoming part of. Eala did the opposite. The Rafa Nadal Academy is not simply a place where talented young players go to hit forehands for a few years. It is built on a philosophy that treats the whole person as the project, not just the athlete. Nadal has spoken about this himself. The idea that discipline, humility, and cultural awareness are not soft extras sitting alongside the technical training, but are actually inseparable from it. The academy places its players inside a full living and learning environment. You are not flying in for a training camp and flying home on weekends. You are there. You are eating there, studying there, laughing and struggling and growing there. For a player arriving from the Philippines at a formative age, that place becomes the lens through which you experience everything about becoming an adult. The Spanish language, for Eala, was not a subject she studied. It was the water she swam in every single day. And there is a difference, a profound one, between someone who has studied a language and someone who has lived inside it long enough that it stops being a second language and starts being simply a language. Researchers who study how humans acquire language talk about a specific threshold, a crossing point where the brain stops translating and starts processing directly. On one side of that threshold, you are always working. Every sentence costs you a little effort. There is always a slight delay, always a background process running, converting what you hear into something your brain can hold, and then converting your thoughts back into something your mouth can say. On the other side of that threshold, none of that is happening. You're just speaking. You're just thinking. The language is no longer a tool you are using. It is part of how your mind moves. Eala crossed that threshold somewhere in the training grounds of Manacor, probably without even noticing when it happened. Which is exactly what made Madrid so devastating in the best possible sense. When she picked up that microphone and spoke, there was no performance happening. There was no internal rehearsal, no mental script, no deep breath before committing to a sentence. She just opened her mouth and the Spanish came out, warm and natural and completely at home on that clay court, in that city, in front of those thousands of people who have spent their entire lives being told that this is their sport, their language, their culture. And they heard it. Spanish crowds are not easily fooled. They have watched international players attempt courtside Spanish for as long as there have been international players. They know the difference between appreciation and authenticity within the first few syllables. They know when someone has memorized a phrase to make them feel good, and they know when someone has genuinely earned the right to stand in front of them and speak. The eruption that followed Eala's words was not politeness. It was not the warm but slightly condescending applause a crowd gives to a foreign player who tries a few words and stumbles charmingly. It was recognition. Pure and immediate and completely unfiltered. It was thousands of people simultaneously realizing that this young woman was not performing for them. She was one of them, in some essential way that had nothing to do with where her passport was issued. Now think about what Becker was processing in that moment. Here is a man who built his entire career competing and communicating in a second language. He is German. English became his professional language through necessity and repetition and years of press conferences and broadcast interviews and sponsor dinners, where the default was always English. He knows what genuine fluency looks like because he has chased it himself. He knows what it costs. He knows how long it takes. He knows that the kind of effortless, crowd-erupting Spanish that Eala delivered on that Madrid court represents years of daily, unglamorous, unfilmed work that nobody ever documents because it happens in canteens and practice sessions and casual conversations between teammates, not in places where cameras are rolling. His silence was the silence of someone who recognized exactly what they were seeing and understood its full weight. The Filipino community, watching that moment, experienced something different again. For them, this was not primarily about Spanish. It was about watching one of their own walk onto one of the biggest stages in professional tennis with absolute authority. There is a particular pride that comes from watching someone who left her country young, who sacrificed the comfort of home and family and language and everything recognizable, and then seeing that person stand tall in front of an international audience and own the room completely. Not despite where she came from, not in spite of her journey. Because of it. Every year in Manicure, every Spanish conversation she pushed through when it would have been easier to retreat into English. Every tournament on European clay where she was the outsider finding her footing. All of that was in that moment. The Filipino fans watching were not just proud of a tennis result. They were proud of a human being who went somewhere difficult and came back as something extraordinary. What makes Eala's story genuinely unprecedented in women's tennis is the specific combination of identities she carries. The sport has seen players bridge cultural gaps before. It has seen players from one country become beloved figures in another. But a Filipino player who trained from a young age at one of Spain's most storied academies, who speaks Spanish not as a courtesy but as a lived language, who connects with Spanish crowds not as a visiting star being gracious, but as someone who grew up in their tennis culture. That combination has simply not existed before in professional tennis. There is no template for it. There is no previous story to compare it to. And that novelty is part of what gave the Madrid moment its electric quality. The crowd was not just reacting to what Eala said. They were reacting to the story they could sense behind it. They were reacting to the realization, arriving all at once, that this player had given years of her life to their country's tennis culture before she ever became famous enough for them to know her name. The contrast between how quietly that story developed and how loudly it announced itself in Madrid is what gives this moment its staying power. Nobody was filming the Tuesday practice sessions. Nobody was running features on how a teenage girl from the Philippines was slowly, steadily absorbing the language and culture of a small town in Mallorca. The media covers matches. It covers rankings. It covers serve speeds and backhand technique and draw bracket analysis. The slow, human story of cultural immersion happening in a training academy far from any spotlight. That story was invisible right up until the moment it walked onto a major WTA stage and made an entire arena lose its mind. And that is the thing about real development, real growth, real transformation. It is almost always invisible until suddenly it is not. Until the moment when all the quiet, private, unglamorous work surfaces publicly and everyone watching wonders where it came from and how it happened so fast, not realizing that it has actually been happening for years, just out of frame. Eala's career from this point forward carries something that most professional players never acquire, a genuine, unscripted, emotionally resonant connection to one of tennis's most passionate markets. Spanish fans do not forget the players who honor their culture. They carry those players with them. They show up for them in ways that go beyond normal fan support. They become invested not just in the results, but in the story. And Eala now has that investment in one of the most important clay court markets on the entire tour, earned not through a PR campaign, or a carefully managed social media presence, but through years of authentic immersion that culminated in 30 seconds on a Madrid court that nobody who was there will forget. The tennis is real. The rankings are trending in the right direction. The clay court game built in Manacor has a technical foundation that most players her age are still years away from developing. But what Madrid gave Eala that no ranking point can capture is a story. A real one. The kind that follows a player through a career and grows richer every time she steps onto a European clay court and the crowd remembers who she is and what she did and what it meant. Boris Becker went quiet because he understood all of this in real time. The Madrid crowd erupted because they felt all of this in real time. And somewhere watching on a screen, thousands of Filipino fans.